everybody. Welcome back to the Realm of History. Got a new little intro there for you. We're here tonight for Chapter 5 live review session. So we'll get it started right away. First of all, I'd like to go over the agenda with you. So what I'm planning to do tonight is go over a few of the key terms, talk about a few of the key figures. Then number 3, we'll get into the AP preparation and some advice that I have for you in getting ready for the AP portion of the quiz tomorrow. And then, of course, like we normally do, we'll do some question and answer time at the end of the session. So to get right into it, to get you going, let's start off with a few of the key terms that I had a lot of questions about today. And I want to make sure that if you didn't get a chance to ask your questions, I wanted to go over this. So a lot of students in both the boys and girls classes had some confusion about Hellenistic Greece versus just the straight up term Hellenistic. So let's take a look at that here first. What I'm looking for with Hellenistic Greece is more geographic in scope. I'm talking about the regions that the Greeks controlled after Alexander's death, basically, and when they sort of had Alexandria as a center point of the Hellenistic world. And when you look at that, Hellenistic Greece, the areas that we would be referring to would be, of course, Macedonia, the Greek city-states, also Egypt, Persia, which would be basically Turkey, Iraq, Iran, kind of all combined, Babylon, parts of Saudi Arabia. Then, of course, you're going to throw in there northern India, which could include at that time Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it's a pretty broad region. It's pretty much all of the areas that Alexander had conquered. And it was what the Macedonians controlled during that time. And then after Alexander's death, those areas were divided to his 3 basic generals. And then those were the areas known as Hellenistic Greece, centered in Alexandria. So that's Hellenistic Greece. On the other end of the spectrum, I want to take a look at just the straight up term Hellenistic. When you look at Hellenistic, one of the things that you really want to understand about Hellenistic is it's just a cultural blend. It's kind of some of those major places that I just mentioned, but how their culture and the cultural diversity and cultural diffusion took place in the city of Alexandria, which really spread ideas, education, like philosophy, mathematics, astronomy. All of those things were spreading from these different cultural practices of, here's the key thing, Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Indian influence. Those are the cultural blends that existed in what we call Hellenistic. So hopefully that clears some of the things up for you right there off the bat. Okay, next. I do have like a blanketed statement of advice here for you, and that's that I would like you to understand that the matching and the multiple choice will be heavily devoted to scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers. Most of which, not all, but most of which came from section 5, which we just covered yesterday. So that's going to be something that I think you should really focus your efforts on studying. If you look at the key terms, I'm looking at them right now. There's not a whole lot there. But if you look at the key figures now, down at the bottom, you're going to see Archimedes, Aristarchus, Eratosthenes, Euclid. You've got Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. All of those individuals are going to be in a matching. And there's going to be more possibilities in that matching than there are responses. So you're going to use some and you're not going to use some others. Also, you really want to make sure that you have a good understanding of having a great detailed response and understanding all of these key figures that are on that sheet. Okay, next, I want to give you some advice, some pointed advice here about the AP portion of your quiz tomorrow. This is going to be the difficult task. This is going to be your challenge once again. So what I did is I looked through the questions that I selected, and one of the things you have to understand is that the College Board, which writes the curriculum and also gives the practice questions, they're going to use some pretty big vocabulary. And some of those words that they throw into the questions, you probably haven't had much experience with. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give you a heads up on some of the words that you're going to see that you probably wouldn't have known in the past. So we're going to take a look at that here together. The first one is austere. When you see the word austere, one of the things that you really have to understand is that that means severe or strict. Okay. So austere is referencing severe or strict in nature, kind of like Draco. We learned about Draco putting together that legal code of laws. We said draconian was a good word for that, but you could also use austere to refer to a situation like Draco or draconian. The next key word is the key vocabulary term that you're going to see in the questions called a decree. A decree is basically an official order issued by a legal authority. So when you say I hereby decree something, that would be something like a king would say that was an official statement that had legal bearing. So if the president comes out and makes a new statement or a new guideline, that could be considered a decree. I'm going to go through these quickly. Next one is pantheon. The word pantheon means a group of famous and or important people. So when you take a look at that, a pantheon is referring to a group of individuals that are usually very well known. So if the question says like, it was a pantheon of military generals, you could say, oh, that was Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Hannibal of Carthage. We haven't gotten to him yet, but so on and so forth. That would be an example of pantheon. And then the next one that you'll see, this is the last one, is valorizing. Valor or valorizing is to give value or validity to something. So you will see those terms in the questions tomorrow. And I think that will give you a little bit of a heads up in being able to answer some of the questions that are going to come your way. Next, the AP stimulus documents. I'm going to give you a huge clue here. The first one, the multiple choice. There's going to be 4 multiple choice based off of this document. It's a document by the Greek historian Thucydides, and the topic is related to the Peloponnesian War. He was writing about what went on in the Peloponnesian War, which was Sparta versus Athens. So this is a direct account of what went on in the dealings of the Peloponnesian War. It dealt with the Lacedaemonians, which was a Greek city-state, and they were mad at Athens, and that kind of started part of the sparring between the two groups. And then you had Sparta getting involved later. And this was all a consequence of the Delian League, which was supposed to be an alliance system to help defend against outside attacks. But what happened is it turned into an infighting situation with the very big city-states of Sparta and then also Athens. So studying up on the Peloponnesian War, studying a little bit up on Thucydides, the Greek historian, would give you an advantage tonight in getting ready for the AP content tomorrow. Second, here's a huge piece of advice for you. The second one is by Xenophon, another Greek historian / philosopher. He was quite a chauvinist, I got to tell you. I put this one in there because a lot of what we learned about with Greece was male dominated. Because if you remember, even in Athens and somewhat in Sparta, they didn't allow women to even vote. That women weren't even considered citizens. So one of the things that you have to understand is that I picked a selection to sort of exemplify that and look at, hey, how backward was this back then? So we need to take a look at that. It's called A Husband's Advice. And you can actually find, here's the cool thing about this one. You can find this one in your World History Patterns of Interaction textbook. It's right in there. The chapter that we just covered, page 129. You can find the actual document there. This is a huge clue for you. It's called A Husband's Advice. And this is regarding how women were treated in Athens and other Greek city-states in general. So what you'll need to do, my suggestion is to read that passage, but think about overall, how were women treated in the Greek city-states, especially Athens, which we know they were not allowed citizenship, they were not allowed to vote, and they had very few rights. This passage is going to probably shock you. This is basically a husband telling his wife how she should not only take care of her appearance, but also some of the things that she should do around the home. So pretty awful if you look at it in today's world. But back then, this is something that was common, unfortunately. So we need to take that into account based on what we've learned and what is there for you. So that is right there in your textbook. Here's a big clue I'm going to drop right now. There's actually 2 questions that you can see right next to the document. They might be on the AP portion of the quiz. So that'd be a huge drop for you right there just for showing up. Okay, now I'm going to flip to the comments here. I have not had a chance to look at them. So what we're going to take a look at here right now is I'm going to go into answering your questions. So I want to see, if you have any key questions or any concerns. I really want to do my best to answer those tonight so that you can go into the quiz tomorrow feeling confident after, this was kind of a rough week, I would say. There's a lot going on. You're transitioning from the fun events back to class, so on and so forth. So 8th hour, my 8th hour girls had to miss their class today. For you ladies, I did post the slideshow that I went through. I made a video for you of me talking through the slideshow. So that is available for you on the weekly agenda of bulletin board. Okay. Will these terms, here's a good question right off the bat. Will these terms be on the quiz tomorrow? I'm assuming you're talking about the terms that I went over for the AP. You're going to see those in the questions. So you're not going to have to answer a question or define them. I was doing that to help you understand what those terms meant so that you could better approach the question. So you will see them, but you're not going to have to actually, answer them or anything like that. Okay, let's go to good question. Here we go. This is a great question, Gabby. Who is Xerxes and what's the difference between Darius and Darius III? Bam, great. Let's talk about this. Number one, let's start with Darius I. Darius I was first, okay? So Darius I invades Greece, and we had the big battle of Marathon. So Darius tried to conquer Athens. He was defeated. He was defeated by the Athenians at Marathon. Fidipides runs the 26.2 miles. That's why we have the Marathon. That was Darius I, this guy right there, versus the Athenians. Xerxes is Darius's son. So Xerxes was like, hey, my dad lost, but I'm going to try to fulfill his dreams, and I'm going to invade Greece during my reign. So Xerxes also invades. He was responsible for the Persians at the battles on your review sheet called Salamis, Thermopylae, and Plataea. Thermopylae was where there were only 300 Spartans, and there were about 300,000 Persians. The Spartans held them off in a phalanx for 3 days. On the first day of battle, there was no Spartan that was killed. 0 Spartans died. That's how effective they were in battle. On day 2, some of the Spartans started to pass. They were killed off in battle. And then in day 3, all of the Spartans, including the Spartan king Leonidas, were killed in the battle. So they gave their lives to buy time for the Greeks. They were not the only ones there. There were 300 Spartans, but there were also about 5,000 other Greeks that came to help. But you're still talking about 530 Greeks holding off 300,000 Persians for 3 days. It's an amazing story. That's why there's a feature film called 300 about it. It came out just a little bit ago. It's pretty graphic, so it's rated R, and it's not very historically accurate, but it is about the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, Darius III is a little bit more distant. He is a relative of Darius and Xerxes, but he comes into play a little bit later. So what you want to know about Darius III, he's the guy we saw in the video clip today, if you were in my class. He is the Persian ruler when Alexander the Great invades. And a key thing to know about Darius, he actually fled the battlefield twice. Alexander actually got close enough in the battle that we were watching today called Gaugamela. Alexander charged on his horse at Darius and threw a spear at him. And it just barely missed Darius III. And Darius got scared and ran away from the battlefield at Gaugamela. He then did that again at a later battle. So he kind of ended his reign as a dishonorable, people called him kind of a coward. And then he was actually assassinated by his own cousin because of his lack of leadership and toughness as a king. If you look at the difference between Alexander, who's out there fighting on the battlefield, and Darius III, who's kind of sitting back, calling directions, and then fleeing the battlefield several times, there's really no comparison there if you're talking about bravado and all of those kind of things, which I don't think that really determines your manhood. But when you're a military leader and you're fighting for your life, that's kind of a thing that you want to know. Yes, Charlie, love it. Love the excitement there. Let's go over your boy Fidipides. Yeah, Fidipides That's not really how you spell it, but that's okay. I love it. That's how you sound it out. So Fidipides is your guy who ran the 26.2 miles from from Marathon at the battlefield to the city of Athens. So he runs that 26.2 miles, and he warns the Athenian people that they had won the battle, so we need to defend the city of Athens. And so that's why we run the marathon today. There is some speculation. Did this occur? Did this not? You can kind of do the research on your own. I love the story, but most accounts say that this is likely to have happened, or something similar to it may have happened. Okay, moving on down the list. Go ahead and fire your questions away. I'm going to move right on down and do my best to get through this. Sure. Repeat okay, can you repeat the definition of Hellenistic Greece? I'll give you the geographic locations again. That's probably what you missed. So with Hellenistic Greece, it's geographic locations of Macedonia, the Greek city-states, Egypt, Persia, and northern India. Okay, those are the basic entities. Now, when I say northern India, I'm talking Afghanistan and Pakistan also involved there at that time. And when I say Persia, I'm talking about Turkey, Iran, Iraq. So those are the things that you want to know, or places that you want to know about Hellenistic Greece. Okay, let's go to the next question. Okay, Emma, good question. Are there any specific essential questions we should know? The essential questions on this quiz, the ones that you have at the top of your notes, will be formulated into multiple choice. Because I did not put, if you know the format, I did not put short answer questions onto the content portion. So I'm going to formulate those into multiple choice questions in this chapter quiz. How much do we need to know about the key battles? The key battles I have on the sheet: Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, Gaugamela. Let me take you through those. Number one, Marathon. I kind of talked just about that with Fidipides. I think we're pretty good on Marathon. You want to know that it was Darius versus Athens. Okay, Persia versus Athens. Athens wins. In Thermopylae, I just talked about that. 300 Spartans versus Xerxes. Xerxes was the leader who invaded Greece in this battle. The Persians win. The Persians win that one. Next one is Salamis. Salamis is the only battle on the list that's a naval battle. That's a naval battle of Athens and many other city-states going against Xerxes and the Persian fleets of ships. The Greeks win big time in that one. They're much better at sea. Athens is really good at sea, by the way. Sparta's really good on land, but Athens is really good at the sea. Next is, I have on my list, Plataea. Plataea was a major victory for the Greeks. It was the Spartans coming together with the Athenians. The first time that they really came together, they thoroughly defeat Xerxes and drive him back out. They drive him back to Persia. Okay, that was a very big loss for the Persians. That ended that second invasion. And then finally, Gaugamela is the battle that, if you were in my class today, you saw the quick video clip. That was Alexander the Great, highly outnumbered in the battle, but using phalanx and cavalry successfully to defeat, really being outnumbered 3-1. He defeated Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela, which took place modern day Syria, outside of a farming town or farming village. Okay, moving our way down the list. Excellent questions today. How much should we know about the key wars? Okay, now the key wars, says Maya, the key wars, we're going to talk about those right now. Trojan War, we went over quite a bit today in the slideshow. We talked about that's the Mycenaean Greeks versus the people of Troy, which was an independent trading city in Anatolia or modern day Turkey. So you're going to want to know that the Mycenaeans win. But you also want to know that we were just recently thinking that this was a real event. I mean, within the last 10 to 20 years. Prior to that, we thought it was all legend, because there's a lot of myth from the epics of Homer. What we know about the Trojan War comes from a lot of the book the epic called the Iliad by Homer. So there's a lot of speculation about it. What we would say about the Trojan War is it was most likely the Mycenaeans versus Troy over trading routes, control of trade routes. That's really what you want to know there. The Persian Wars, there's a series of wars. The Persian Wars span from, when Darius invades Greece to when Xerxes invades Greece, right? So you want to know that Greece wins both, but there were some pretty key battles that we just went over, going from Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. Those would all be battles in the Persian Wars, but the Greeks come out victorious in all of those, except for Thermopylae. Thermopylae was a Greek loss. Finally, the Peloponnesian War. You want to know a lot about that one, both for the content and for the AP. That's Sparta versus Athens. Sparta wins. Athens suffered the plague of Athens, which was a disease because they were malnourished. They were having trouble getting food. So you want to know kind of the ins and outs of that. You want to also know that, I think one of you said this in class, actually. It might have been you, Maya. They wanted to fight. Sparta wanted to fight on land, but Athens wanted to fight at sea. And so it took a while for them to really meet on any battlefield. And then eventually they did, and the Spartans come out victorious. Okay. Yes. Okay. Brooklyn, good question. Stoicism. We talked about Stoicism in section 5. When we think about Stoicism, okay, what we want to think about is that you want to live a virtuous life. You want to have virtue. We talked about what virtue was. Virtue was like a moral code of ethics that you want to follow. And so when we're thinking about a virtuous life, you're thinking back then, Stoics believed that you should live a virtuous life under the will of God or the gods. And so they're not into the human pleasures, okay? They're not into like fine foods or fine music or other things. They're definitely not looking at hedonism, which is all about human pleasure. They're really focused on keeping an even keel, never getting really too excited, never really getting too down on yourself, but kind of keeping things even and narrow. And then also they thought that those human passions needed to be kept in check, like wealth, greed, lust. They believe you should keep those things in check. That really is that's a pretty good amount of information that I would like you to know about Stoicism right there. Good question. All right, next one up right after that one is the opposite of that. Graves says Epicureanism. That was the next term in our lesson. So when we take a look at Epicureanism, that's the opposite. Epicureans, they believe the world is made up of atoms. You know, they think that the only things that, the only objects that are real are those that can be perceived by the five senses, right? And so for them, they do believe that there are gods, but they don't believe the gods care about humans. They're like, the gods have better things to do than care about humans. So we're going to live our lives and we're going to try to enjoy life as much as possible. Okay. So whereas Stoicism is like, no, we don't want to enjoy those human passions too much. Epicureans are like, let's party down. Let's live life to the fullest. Okay. You might say, what do you guys say? YOLO, you only live once, kind of that kind of thing when you're thinking about Epicureanism. All right, Cleisthenes. Yes, let's go over Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes, probably the most important of the democratic reformers. When you're thinking Draco, Solon, Cleisthenes, they're all three democratic reformers from Athens. So what they did, all of them, would be to introduce political and economic reforms. When we say reforms, that means changes. So one of the things that I really want you to take into account here is that Cleisthenes did a lot. He really focused on creating political and economic reforms, but he creates the Council of the 500, which gives people that were randomly selected a chance to propose laws. He also, when we're thinking about Cleisthenes, he also kind of made a very strict or severe restriction on who was a citizen, like who could vote. And under his control, it was limited. It was limited to adult males that were free, not slaves, but free, that owned land. They had to own land. They also had to be born in Athens. So the only way that you could vote would be an adult male, born in Athens, and you had to own land. So there weren't that many people who could vote under Cleisthenes. That's why it's called a limited democracy. I would say Brooklyn and everybody else, those are probably the most important things to know about Cleisthenes. Euclid, on the other hand, is a mathematician. Euclid, you want to think geometry. When you think Euclid, think geometry. For example, he wrote a book called The Elements. And that book that he wrote was used up into the 1980s as a textbook in U.S. mathematics classrooms right here in our country. Okay, so his influence on modern geometry is tremendous. So he's a mathematician focused on geometry. A lot of his work sets the basis for what we study today in geometry class. Xerxes won the Battle of Thermopylae. He lost Salamis and he lost Plataea. Okay. All right, moving on down the list. I'm trying to play catch up here. I'm getting close. All right. J. Simpson. Here we go. Which Darius offered half the land and troops? That's Darius III. And he offered that to Alexander. And Alexander turned him down. Alexander rejected because he wanted to conquer everything. So that's the answer to that question. Okay, I went over key wars and I went over geography. Yeah, something like that. So I went over the key wars. Geography. You want to know those maps on 121 and 124. You want to know all of the key city-states that are mentioned there. You want to know the seas because of how important they were for trade. Obviously, Alexandria, Egypt was a huge component that we talked about. Macedonia. And then finally, I have on the list, if you look at the very bottom of geography, I've got Mycenaeans, Dorians, Macedonians. The reason I put that on there is because that's actually the order. That's actually the order in which those Greek groups controlled Greece. First, it was the Mycenaeans. Then when they go out of power, the Dorians come in. And we know that under the Dorians, they didn't have written records. So we have kind of a gap of 400 years of time in which we don't know a whole lot about Greece under the Dorians. And then eventually we have the Macedonians coming in. They conquered Greece. And then you have the whole story of Philip and Alexander. So some of the highlights there about geography. Sophie, I went over Stoicism just a moment ago. Hopefully you were listening there. I'm hoping that you're covered there. If not, throw another chat in there, and I'll definitely go over it again. It's a philosophy where you believe in living a virtuous life under the harmony of the gods. Let's see here. Oops, hit the wrong button. Oh, I see there's a little bit of picture war going on, so I'll take that off. But that's really funny, by the way. That's making me laugh. I don't want to get too much into it, but okay, can you go over what we need to know about Alexander the Great? Well, there's quite a bit. First of all, he probably the greatest military strategist that we've covered thus far, and really, furthermore, one of the greatest in the history of the world. Also, when you think about Alexander, you want to think about his conquest. He was very driven to conquer as much land as possible. He put his troops at a disadvantage in doing that. I mean, 11 years away from their family, covering and marching 11,000 miles, that's pretty extreme. But I think one of the most important things to remember about Alexander, when I talked about his legacy in class, is how he governed. You know, this is so important because he treated the people that he conquered extremely well in comparison to other key leaders. And I think that is one, if you wanted to remember anything about Alexander, that would be one of the things that made him so successful, is how he accepted the cultural practices, the religions of the people that he conquered. Let's get it straight. Alexander the Great was not the best human being. He ordered the murder. He ordered the assassination of many people. He killed people himself. He threw a spear at one of his own generals and killed him during a drunken party. Okay. He wasn't the best guy. He was a very effective ruler. That's one of the things that you also want to think about there. Okay. Where was Xerxes from, says Jay Simpson. Xerxes was from Persia. Lark says more detail about Thermopylae and Salamis. Okay, so Thermopylae, when we're thinking about Thermopylae was, 300,000 Persians versus 300 Spartans and about 5,000 other Greeks that were helping. At Thermopylae, there were 3 days of battle. On the first day of battle, the Persians charged and the Spartans held them off there wasn't a single Spartan that died in that battle, but there were about 15,000 Persians that died on the first day. The second day, about half the Spartans were killed and thousands more Persians died. And then on the third day, the Greeks were just overwhelmed. Xerxes sent in the full forces on Sparta, and even the Spartan king who fought alongside of his men in a phalanx was killed on that battlefield that day. So basically what you want to know about Thermopylae is it was actually fought in a strategic location, though, too. This is a key detail that you might want to know if you really want to dive into this. It was fought at a place called the Hot Gates, which was a mountain pass, which is very narrow. So geographically and strategically, this allowed the Spartans to get into a phalanx in that mountain pass, and they funneled all of the Persians into that mountain pass, which really eradicated their numerical value. I mean, it kind of closed them down to where they could only fight in a narrow space between what was called the Hot Gates. And so that's really why the Spartans were so successful. That's a piece of detail that you might want to know. But in the end, I mean, when you have 300,000 versus 5,300, it's going to be a matter of time when they overwhelm you. The other part of that was Salamis. Salamis, a naval battle. Some of the details that I can tell you is that Xerxes recruited a bunch of different civilizations like Egyptians, Phoenicians, and people from Turkey that were pretty good at sailing, and he kind of put a makeshift fleet together, and they tried to defeat the Greeks. The Greeks had these ships, though, called triremes. If maybe at the end, if you stay around, I can pull up a picture of a trireme, but it's basically a ship that has an underwater battering ram. It was made of iron and bronze. That underwater was a battering ram that if they here's a ship, and then here's the trireme. If they hit the Persian ship underwater, it would poke a hole or puncture the hull of the Persian ship, and those Persian ships went down. The way that you fought at Navy in the sea back then is you kind of got your ship up close to your opponent's ship, and then you threw ropes or boards, and you actually walked across and then fought hand-to-hand combat on the ship. So that was one way that you did that. The other way was to ram into the ship and try to take it out that way. We didn't have gunpowder, so you can't go shooting cannon or anything like that yet. So Salamis was a really, really bloody battle at sea. They say that so many Persians were knocked overboard by these triremes that there were sharks that came in to the Mediterranean Sea to feast on some of the bodies. So it was pretty graphic there. But I think what you want to think about is that Xerxes tried to put together a makeshift navy of all these different groups. And so their organization just wasn't as strong as the Athenian navy. And that's one of the key details as to why the Greeks win. Socrates. Sure, Socrates was a major philosopher. He's really one of the first philosophers. But Kiera, one of the things I want you to know about Socrates is that he actually was really an oddball. He kind of spoke out against the Greek gods. He's like, what are we worshiping these Greek gods? They don't really exist. But he was teaching this to kids. Like, he was a tutor, and all these rich families would pay him to teach their children history and math and science and all the other subjects. But while he was doing that, he's kind of telling them, hey, don't listen about these gods. There's no real gods of the wind and the sun. So he was kind of a skeptic, and he kind of rubbed people the wrong way. He was actually condemned to death. He was put to death in Athens for his views eventually. So kind of a rebel, but a very bright man. He was the first philosopher in the series of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Plato was his student, and then Aristotle was Plato's student. So Socrates comes up with a lot of methods. I don't know if you've heard of the Socratic method. Like, if you have a teacher who teaches by asking you questions, they just keep asking you questions, and then you kind of figure out the answer as you do research or you think deep about it. That's called the Socratic method. And we're going to do that sometimes in our class, where we'll have a Socratic seminar where kind of you pose a question and you discuss the question, and you kind of come to a conclusion. Whether you've studied this material or not, you might be able to come to logical conclusions about it. Socrates starts that. So those are some of the things that you want to know about Socrates, which are all detailed in the section that you did the outline on, section 3 at the end. All right, Philip II. Yes, Philip II was a Macedonian king. He's Alexander the Great's father. One of the things to remember about Philip II is that he forms one of the world's first professional armies. Professional armies are those that are trained daily. They're paid to do their job. And he introduces the phalanx, the phalanx that we saw today in the slideshow, 16 men wide by 16 men deep, and the use of cavalry in battle, which Alexander copied from his father and utilized greatly. I would also say that he was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding, so he couldn't fulfill his two goals. His two goals were, number one, to conquer Greece, and then number two, he wanted to eventually invade Persia, but he was killed at his daughter's wedding by a former guardsman. So he wasn't able to accomplish both of those tasks. Alexander accomplishes the second task of invading and conquering Persia, though. All right, Sophie B says, can you elaborate on Cleisthenes? A couple of things that I want to talk about Cleisthenes. Number one, a democratic reformer. Number two, divided people up into districts based on where they lived. This gives us our idea of voting districts today. Number three, he creates what's called the Council of 500, which were 500 randomly selected citizens who then could work in government and propose laws. Number four, put severe restrictions on who could be a citizen. He said that to be a citizen of Athens, which means voting rights, you had to be an adult male, you had to own land, okay, and you had to be born in Athens. So those are some of the key things to know about Cleisthenes. Master Smith, Draco. Draco was really severe. He put together a legal code that was supposed to keep people equal under the law, but it was so strict because almost every crime was punishable by death. And so people kind of grew tired of that. They kind of figured that it was a tyrannical style of rule. But he did make other reforms, like he put out debt slavery out there so that if you owed someone money, you'd have to be their slave, which was kind of drastic, but is something that went on as well. So those are some of the important factors with Draco. Check out this next one. Oh, good question. Avery says, was Sparta's democracy different from Athens, or were they both direct democracies? Great question. Athens was a direct democracy. Sparta did not practice democracy. Sparta practiced an oligarchy. So Sparta had a few powerful individuals that ruled. Basically, the system in Sparta was there were two kings. Okay, let me explain. One king was responsible for military. One king was responsible for politics or government. And then they had five elders, five older citizens that also made decisions. So you have really seven powerful individuals making decisions in Sparta. So Sparta was not a democracy, but they were an oligarchy. Athens, as you explained, was a direct or limited democracy. Will the husband's advice poem be on the test as well? Yes, sir. That's going to be on your AP portion. Yes. Plato's theory. Well, we want to talk about Plato's Republic. Plato was a student of Socrates, and Plato wrote a book called The Republic. And in this book, he talked about a kind of an ideal place or a utopian society. A utopia means a perfect place in Greek. But when you think about utopia, it could be either an ideal place or a perfect place. So in Plato's Republic, there was no greed, there was no money. So that's sort of his ideology on how you could have a perfect place. Okay, and that's what he's really writing about there, Sophie. Aristotle is Plato's student. So Aristotle wrote down, well, first of all, Plato wrote down all of Socrates' lessons, and then Aristotle recorded all of Plato's lessons. When you're thinking about Aristotle, I wouldn't really focus on one particular thing. They're all sort of skeptical of the gods. They all believed in logic. All three of these philosophers believed in deductive logic. Logic is looking at the world in a logical sense, or using scientific observation, using analytical thought to come up with conclusions. Really, these guys before the scientific method was a thing, they were using the scientific method to come to conclusions. And they were also constantly searching for the truth. For them, you get to the truth through logic. You don't just say, oh, the wind blows because of the goddess of the wind. You say, let's figure out exactly why the wind is blowing using logical, scientific thought process. So for Aristotle, that was the metacognitive practice, the metaphysical practice of Aristotle was teaching about logical thought and evaluation. Julian says, why was Eratosthenes important? So Eratosthenes was, first of all, the director of the library at Alexandria. So he was a big time baller, and a lot of the other scholars who were coming to study there, of course, had to follow his lead. So Eratosthenes, though, in doing some of his work and in running the library, had a goal of calculating the circumference of the earth, and he was pretty close in his estimate. So why is he important? Number one, believing that the earth was round, and then number two, giving us an estimate in the ancient world that was within 4,000 miles of the actual size, without satellite images, without any major instruments of scientific observation, and then also without knowing what other land masses were out there. Like, no Greek person knew that the Americas existed. So for him to be that close is just a magnificent estimate. All right, let's see. Maya says, are we going to have to compare or relate Philip II and Alexander the Great? Yeah, I mean, comparison, they're father and son, they're very similar. I would say relating would be something you need to do. You need to know that they are related, that Philip II was the father of Alexander the Great. And so they're going to have a lot of similarities there. Both kings of Macedonia, both very well educated, but both very strong military leaders. All right, Brett says Archimedes and Aristarchus. Let's talk Archimedes first. Archimedes, a scientist from Sicily, accurately estimated pi, which is 3.14, and then all the other numbers. I'm not going to get into that. And then also was an inventor. He created a pulley system. He created the Archimedes screw, which we talked about in class, which I'm not a scientist, but the screw would turn in a way, and it was riveted to where it would be, if you put it under water, as it rotates, it could draw water up the screw. And then you could use that water for irrigation or other purposes. So that's Archimedes. That's what I'm breaking it down to what you really need to know. Aristarchus studied at Alexandria also, and he came up with the two important conclusions that, number one, the sun is larger than the earth. And then number two, he said that the sun was the center of the universe, which for them, the universe was everything. We know today that the universe is much larger than what they thought. So really, we know that the sun is the center of our solar system. But for them, they called that the universe. And so he said that the planets and the other and the earth actually rotated around the sun, which was way ahead of his time. As we learned, people in the Middle Ages up until Galileo believed that the earth was the center. Okay. Okay, a war and a battle. Difference between a war and a battle. So let me give you an example with the Persian Wars. The Persian Wars are just a series of wars, for example, Avery, that involved Persia versus the Greeks, okay? Battles would be individual conflicts that took place in those wars. So we've got the Persian Wars, that's the bigger picture, and then you've got the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. So the war would be like Ford Motor Company, okay? The battles would be equivalent to Taurus, Escape, Expedition, the different actual car names, okay, within Ford. What do you call them? Models, car models that Ford makes, if you can understand that comparison there. Maya says again, are we going to have to compare Philip and Alexander? No. I think what you said before about relating would be yes. Comparing them, not really. Euclid. Yes, Euclid was a mathematician, and Euclid is most involved with geometry. A lot of his work forms the basis of what we study in geometry today. Brett says, where is the Husband's Advice poem? That's on page 129 in your textbook. You can find it right there. That's a huge clue for you. You can read that. There's going to be questions about it. I even said earlier that the questions might be right there next to it, so that could help you out. Okay, I'm open to any more questions. I think I made it through all the questions now. We still have 45 students on, which is awesome. Fire away. Oh, here we go. The Kirkulator. Everybody has to know. I'm responsible for the Kirkulator. He's my guy, Kicker Kirk, having a pretty good week again. So he's a nice kid. Let's talk about his question, though. Sorry, Kirk, I didn't want to throw that out there at you, but is it only multiple choice on the AP section? No, there's multiple choice, and then there is going to be 2 short answer questions. So that will answer that. Gabby says, are there going to be any writing questions or written questions on the content part of the quiz? No, it's straight up multiple choice and matching, 40 questions. Your writing will come in the 2 questions on the AP portion. Hey, Nicholas, how you doing? Peace. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining. Graves, Pericles. Yes, Pericles. I talked about him in the slideshow today, but your boy Pericles had 3 goals for Athens. This is really the most important. He was a great military leader, great politician of Athens. But let's talk about those 3 goals that he had. Number 1, he wants to strengthen the Athenian democracy. And the way that I taught you today about how he wanted to do that and what was covered in section 3 is that he wants to increase the public payroll. What that means is that he wants to actually pay government officials to do their job. Prior to this, they were just volunteers. So the accountability level for a volunteer is not as strong as it would be if you're paying someone. That's number 1. Number 2, the second goal is he wants to not only hold on to the current Athenian empire, he wants to expand it. And the only way to do that, if you're Athens, you're going to have to go out to sea and conquer some islands and other city-states. So he has to focus on developing a strong navy. Okay, so Pericles wants to expand the empire, and he focuses on developing a strong navy. And then third, a pretty simple one, he wants to focus on glorifying Athens through art and architecture. That brings me to another point. One of the terms on your sheet is classical art. Let me define that, because that was also from section 3, and we didn't really get to go over that. Classical art is a very famous Greek style. It focuses on perfection. Classical art was predicated on balance, order, proportion, beauty. Like when you look at Greek sculptures from the classic Greek period, which is what we're learning about, they're all like very ripped. They have great muscle definition. They have 6-pack abs. Okay. So not all Greeks were looking that good. All right. What they tried to show is ideal beauty in classical art, not realism. Okay. So classical art focuses on ideal beauty, not realism. So a lot of the statues and sculptures that you see from Greece are not necessarily showing the people how they actually looked. And if you want to think about it a little bit deeper, one of the things that you have to understand is that would a king or a military general like Pericles per se, would they want to have a statue or a sculpture of them looking bad? And if the artist made them look bad, what might be the ramifications of that? So just being real with you, I mean, these kings are paying these sculptors to make statues of them. They want to look like really good. And so that's part of classical art in comparison to later art forms, which are more realistic. John, that also answers your question. Via, are the AP short questions going to have a reading portion, which we then answer the question about? Yes, let's pull that one up. Via, great question. So I'm telling you, the reading portion for the short answer questions is the passage on 129 called A Husband's Advice. And the questions, the short answer questions, will be predicated on that reading right there. So if you wanted to read that tonight, if you wanted to do some research from what I taught you about how women were treated, if you wanted to do a little bit of further research on how women were treated, you could definitely get that in, and you'd be ahead of the game tomorrow. Brett says, who was Darius? There's two Darius. Darius 1 was the guy who invaded Greece at the Battle of Marathon and lost. He's Xerxes' dad. Darius 3 was the guy who was the king of Persia when Alexander the Great invaded. Maya says, I can't pull Maya's questions up because it's always a different picture and I don't want to get anybody embarrassed. So it's pretty funny. It's funny, but I don't want to embarrass anybody. Do we need to know about Hypatia and what she studied and taught? I did have Hypatia on the board. Some classes I ran out of time. Some classes I talked about her. She was a philosopher that came a little bit later. What I was trying to accomplish with that is that all the key philosophers that we talked about in the textbook were males. I wanted to show you that there were female philosophers out there, okay? And I just wanted to give you an example. So she taught mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy at Alexandria, but a little bit later than the time period. Hypatia is not going to show up on the quiz because she came into play after the fact of what we're learning about. Okay, so I was just trying to do my due diligence in representing both of the genders and their accomplishments from Alexandria. Just in case, Socrates was a philosopher from Athens, a key philosopher from Athens. He's covered in section 3 in depth. Nice question, Nick. We already went over fidipides. I think everybody's pretty good on fidipides. Okay. Other questions, AP ballers? Any questions that you have, please fire away. Okay. I don't see any questions popping in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start talking for a minute here about my final suggestion. My final suggestion is always the same. Number 1, complete the review sheet. Number 2, I would like you to read through your notes carefully. Read through all of your notes, sections 1 through 5. This is the biggest chapter that we've covered. You have a lot of notes to read. Read them tonight. Read them tomorrow morning. Read them. You won't have seminar, so you can't use seminar, but read them as much as you possibly can. Quiz yourself off of the review sheet. That's why I have you do it on a separate sheet. You've been doing very well as a whole. I want to see, okay, 16 plus average. If you can score a 16 plus, you are balling out of control. I want to see 7 plus on the AP. Those are our goals tomorrow. 16 or better on the content, 7 or better on the AP. It can be done. It was done by quite a few students in the last quiz, and I thought last quiz was pretty difficult. This one, it's a new quiz. I made this one this year a little different because of the circumstances of Spirit Week. There's a lot going on, so I kind of toned it down a little bit. So I can't really give you like historical numbers. I knew that last week was going to be difficult. This week, I think it's a challenge, but I'm not exactly sure because it's a brand new quiz for me. Xerxes was a Persian king that invaded Greece and ended up losing at the Battle of Plataea. Were any of the key figures we went over tyrants? I'm going to say your key figures, Draco, Solon, and Cleisthenes, they took power by appealing to the common people. So you could consider them tyrants. And remember, tyrants weren't always bad. It's just a leader that takes power by appealing to the common people. So I think that would qualify those 3 individuals there. Hey, Webb. Nice to see you, buddy. Good luck in your game tomorrow, Webb. Play hard. That's important. Okay. I'm pretty much done with my part. I'm going to stay on for another minute if you have any key questions, but I want to wish you a great night. Okay. Make sure that you thank your parents for everything that they do to you or do for you. I'm sorry. And make sure that you are praying the prayer of gratitude. When we pray the prayer of gratitude, I want to encourage you to thank God for all the blessings that we have. All of the blessings that we have. You know, when you get in the car in the morning, if you're driving and it starts up, thank you, Lord Jesus. When you wake up in the morning and you're able to have this great day, thank you, Lord, for giving me this day. When you get to school on time, thank you, Lord Jesus. If you're a guy, whatever your events are tomorrow during the field events, if you stay safe and you have fun, thank you, Lord, for giving me this day. If you're wearing neon, and if you're having a dance off, which is where I'll be at tomorrow, thank you, good Lord, for allowing us to do this and have fun during school. Not everybody gets to do that in the world, so just praying that prayer of gratitude is very important. Okay, I see some questions popping in. Yes, Kiera, you can throw those notes back in. That's totally fine. The type notes are exactly what you need to resubmit to me. That's totally fine. Yeah, Maya, I don't know about that one. I don't have any pictures like that, so I can't do that one. Sorry. All right. Have a great night, everybody, and I appreciate all of you, and I want you to do well on that quiz tomorrow. I see some thank yous. I want to say thank you to you, girls and boys. I mean, coming here and putting in the effort is a sign of strength, and so I appreciate that. Brett, yep, you need to make any notes that you missed. You're responsible for making up. Yes, sir. So you can use the video lessons on YouTube, or you could do it out of the book, or if a friend takes a picture, send it to you, and then you copy it down. You got a lot of options, but yeah, you have to have all the notes done by quiz day. Yes, sir. All right, I am out for the night. We've been on for an hour. It's our longest one of the year. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night, and God bless. Yes, like it, Grace. Love it. Nice job.